The sound of Emily Carter's heels clicked in a steady rhythm as she walked into Westmont Interiors, coffee in one hand, sketch folder in the other. It was barely 8 o'clock, yet the office lights were still dim. Only the hum of the copier and the faint smell of fresh paint from a recently renovated showroom filled the air. Emily liked it that way, quiet, unhurried, and free from the noise of chatter. She'd been with the company for 3 years and had built a reputation for being the first to arrive and the last to leave. She set her coffee down, opened her laptop, and began scrolling through design drafts for an upscale penthouse project. Every detail mattered to her, from the texture of the upholstery to the exact hue of a marble countertop. She didn't believe in half-done work. Clients trusted her with their homes, and she respected that trust like a sacred rule. As the office slowly filled with people, Emily's concentration didn't waver. A few of her colleagues passed by with cheerful greetings. "Morning, Emily," said Jenny from the marketing team, holding a donut box. "Want one before the others wipe it out?" Emily smiled, shaking her head. "No thanks, Jenny. If I eat one, I'll need another and another. I'm staying safe." Jenny laughed and moved on. Moments like this kept Emily grounded. Small, warm exchanges that reminded her work didn't have to be cold and robotic. She wasn't unfriendly, she just preferred to keep her focus sharp. By mid-morning, the air shifted slightly. The glass doors to the executive wing opened, and Daniel Westmont stepped out. His presence was impossible to miss. Not because Emily paid attention, but because the man carried himself like every space belonged to him. He was tall, polished, the kind of man who could make a simple suit look like a magazine cover. Emily glanced up briefly out of politeness, then returned to her laptop. She didn't notice the way his eyes lingered on her, or the half smirk that touched his lips before he walked away. To her, Daniel was just the boss's husband. A name occasionally mentioned in company events, sometimes in casual gossip, but never of real interest. Emily had no reason to think beyond that. At noon, she joined a small group of colleagues in the break room. As they chatted about weekend plans, one of them teased, "Emily, do you even know what a weekend is? Or is work your only hobby?" She rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "My hobby is making sure you all look good in front of the clients." "You're welcome." Laughter followed, and for a moment, the stress of deadlines lifted. The day passed in the rhythm Emily knew so well. Emails, design approvals, supplier calls. As she gathered her things late in the evening, the office was nearly empty again. Outside the glass walls, the city lights shimmered against the dark sky. She felt a small wave of satisfaction. Another day done right. She didn't know that the same dedication she was proud of had already drawn attention she neither sought nor wanted. And somewhere, behind the closed doors of the executive office, Daniel Westmont was still thinking about the junior designer who never seemed to notice him at all. The next morning felt like any other. Emily was halfway through adjusting a mood board for a new client when her desk phone rang. The caller ID made her sit a little straighter. Victoria Westmont, CEO. "Emily, come to my office. Now." Victoria's voice was clipped, offering no room for questions. Emily hung up, frowning. She quickly saved her work, grabbed her notepad, and made her way toward the glass-walled corner office that overlooked the city. She'd been in there only a handful of times, always for project updates or presentations. Today felt different. Victoria was seated behind her sleek mahogany desk, her sharp eyes fixed on a file in front of her. She didn't offer a smile or the usual pleasantries. Instead, she gestured to the chair opposite her. "Sit?" Emily obeyed, heart beginning to tap against her ribs. "I'll get straight to the point," Victoria began, her tone icy. "I've received concerning feedback about your behavior with my husband." Emily blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "Your husband? Daniel?" Victoria's gaze hardened. "Yes. Several people have noticed you lingering near him during office events, speaking to him in ways that could be considered overly familiar." Emily's mouth fell open slightly. "With all due respect, Mrs. Westmont, I've never—" "Don't interrupt me," Victoria cut in sharply. "Whether you intended it or not, the perception is damaging. I won't have rumors affecting this company or my personal life." A rush of heat flooded Emily's face. "I haven't done anything inappropriate. I barely speak to him outside of polite greetings. My focus is on my work, not what? Victoria leaned forward, her voice low but laced with venom. Not the man who happens to own half of this company? Do you expect me to believe his attention toward you is purely coincidental? Emily's throat tightened. I didn't even notice he was giving me any attention. That, Victoria said, snapping the file shut, is either a lie or an admission of carelessness. Either way, I can't keep you here. Emily froze. You're firing me? Victoria didn't flinch. Effective immediately. HR will handle the paperwork. You can collect your belongings today. It felt like the air had been punched out of her lungs. She sat there for a moment, trying to process the words, then stood slowly. I've done nothing wrong, she said, her voice quieter now, steadier. If Daniel's crossed a line, that's on him, not me. Victoria's expression didn't change. Goodbye, Miss Carter. Goodbye, Miss Carter. Emily left the office, her mind spinning. A few curious eyes were already glancing her way. She began packing her things into a cardboard box, each movement deliberate. She could hear faint whispers, her name, Daniel's name, but she didn't look up. She walked out of Westmont Interiors without another word, the click of her heels echoing down the hallway. She felt humiliated, but beneath that humiliation, something else was beginning to take shape. A quiet, simmering resolve. They could take her job, but they weren't going to take her dignity. Not without a fight. If you want, I can make Chapter 3, The Walk of Shame, next, showing Emily's emotional crash, the gossip spreading, and the first seed of her revenge taking root. That chapter will set up her transformation arc. A security guard from the building appeared at her side before Emily had even finished taping the last box shut. It wasn't aggressive. He was polite, almost apologetic, but his presence made everything worse. She knew what it looked like to the others. Being escorted out meant you had done something wrong. And in an office where whispers traveled faster than email, she didn't need to imagine the stories already forming. As she walked toward the elevator with the guard trailing discreetly behind, Emily could hear it. Soft, hurried voices, the kind people used when they didn't want to be caught. Is that her? With Mr. Westmont? I heard Victoria saw them. Her jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes forward. The elevator doors slid open, and she stepped inside, feeling every pair of eyes on her back until the doors closed. The moment they did, the silence was deafening. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. When she reached the lobby, the guard nodded politely and left her at the revolving doors. Outside, the city bustled as usual, people hurrying to lunch, delivery bikes weaving between cars. But Emily felt strangely disconnected, like the noise and movement were happening in another world. She stood on the sidewalk with her box of belongings balanced against her hip, unsure where to go. Her phone buzzed. It was Chloe. Hey, Em, I was just thinking. Chloe's cheerful voice stopped abruptly. What's wrong? You sound off. Emily swallowed. I got fired. The words tasted bitter. What? What happened? Emily found a nearby bench and sat down, placing the box beside her. Victoria accused me of getting too close to Daniel. There was a pause, then Chloe's voice hardened. That's ridiculous. You've never even liked the man. You've told me yourself you avoid him at events. I know, Emily said, her voice trembling between disbelief and anger. But she wouldn't listen. She didn't even want an explanation. It's like she already decided I was guilty. Chloe sighed, a sharp sound over the line. So she punishes you for something her husband did? That's pathetic. Emily stared down at her hands. I didn't even notice him. I was too busy with work, and now I'm out, just like that. Emily, listen to me, Chloe said, her tone shifting to the voice she used when she meant business. This isn't about you doing something wrong. This is about them protecting themselves. You need to fight this. Emily let out a humorless laugh. Fight a CEO and her rich husband? With what? My severance pay? You're not alone, Chloe said firmly. We'll talk tonight. I have some ideas. They hung up, and Emily sat there for a few minutes longer, watching people pass by without noticing her. She felt exhausted, but beneath the exhaustion was a slow burn, a mixture of hurt, anger, and something sharper. She didn't know it yet, but this was the moment the first crack formed in her patience. By the time she stood and picked up the box, The humiliation was still there, but so was a thought she hadn't allowed herself before. They did this to me. And one day, they're going to regret it. 2 months before Emily Carter's sudden dismissal, Daniel Westmont had first noticed her at the company's winter gala. She wasn't standing under the bright lights with the others, laughing loudly or clinking champagne glasses. Instead, she was near the back of the room, checking the floral arrangements on the display tables and straightening a crooked frame on the wall. She wasn't even part of the event planning team, but she clearly cared about how the company presented itself. Daniel had watched her from across the room while making small talk with a client. She wasn't the most glamorous woman there. Victoria always won that title without trying. But there was something about Emily's quiet focus that drew his attention. She didn't look at him the way most people did, with that mix of admiration and calculated interest. In fact, she didn't seem to look at him at all. For Daniel, that was unusual, and unusual was intriguing. In the weeks after the gala, he began finding excuses to pass by her desk. Sometimes it was under the pretense of delivering a message from Victoria, though he could have easily sent an email. Other times it was to check on a project's progress, leaning casually on her desk while she typed. He noticed she never encouraged conversation beyond polite replies. Her eyes stayed on her computer, her hands kept working. The more she ignored him, the more he wanted to see if she would crack. "You always work this hard?" he'd asked one afternoon, his tone light, but loaded with suggestion. She glanced up only briefly. Deadlines don't meet themselves. No smile, no blush, just the answer of someone who genuinely didn't care to play along. Daniel had smiled to himself as he walked away, convinced that underneath her cool exterior, she must be aware of his attention. He began upping his efforts, complimenting her choice of dress color in the hallway, standing a little too close when they reviewed a design board in the meeting room, brushing against her arm in ways that could be dismissed as accidental. Each time, she would step back, shift her focus, or redirect the conversation. What Daniel didn't realize, or perhaps refused to admit, was that Emily's disinterest was real. She wasn't playing hard to get. She simply wasn't interested at all. But to a man like Daniel, who was used to people reacting to his charm, her indifference became a challenge he couldn't resist. One afternoon, he dropped by her workstation under the excuse of asking about a client's preferred wood finish. As she explained, he barely listened to her words, instead noting the faint scent of her shampoo and the way the afternoon light caught in her hair. He left that day convinced he could get her attention if he just tried harder. What he didn't account for was the thin line between harmless persistence and dangerous assumption, a line he was already crossing without realizing that someone else, someone with a sharp and jealous eye, was watching his every move. The first few days after leaving Westmont Interiors felt like a blur. Emily would wake up early out of habit, make coffee, and sit at her kitchen table with her laptop open, scrolling through job postings. She applied to everything that fit her skills: design firms, boutique agencies, even freelance project listings. For the first time in years, she had no schedule, no deadlines, just an endless stretch of hours to fill. At first, she was hopeful. She had a strong portfolio, solid references from previous jobs, and glowing client feedback. But one by one, the responses started to come in. Polite rejections, vague apologies about finding a candidate whose background aligns better, and worse, complete silence. By the end of the week, she started to notice something unsettling. A few firms she'd applied to were ones she'd worked with before as a subcontractor. They knew her work and her professionalism. Yet when she followed up, the tone of the replies had shifted, guarded, hesitant, as if they were trying to avoid saying something outright. The realization came slowly, like water seeping under a door. Victoria's behind this. It made sense. Someone like Victoria, with her reach in the design industry, could shut doors before Emily even had a chance to knock, and she would do it without leaving any trace that could be used against her. On the fourth day, Emily sat slouched on her couch, staring blankly at her phone when Chloe's name lit up the screen. "Still nothing?" Chloe asked, her voice laced with concern. "Nothing," Emily sighed. It's like someone's put a black mark next to my name. Even firms desperate for staff aren't calling me back. Chloe didn't hesitate. That's not a coincidence. Victoria's making sure you stay out of the industry. She's cutting you off completely. Emily rubbed her temples. I can't even prove it. And without proof, what can I do? You don't need to prove it to me, Chloe said. You just need to start fighting smart. Remember Mark Hayes? Emily's brow furrowed. Mark, from college? The one who used to argue with professors for fun? Chloe chuckled. That's the one. He's a corporate lawyer now. A good one. I think you should call him. Emily hesitated. She hadn't spoken to Mark in years, not since graduation, but Chloe's voice carried a certainty that made her consider it. And you think he'd even remember me? Emily, trust me, he'll remember. And if there's anyone who knows how to handle people like the Westmonts, it's him. That night, Emily sat at her desk with her phone in hand, staring at Mark's number that Chloe had texted over. She thought about the weeks she'd spent building her life, only to have it ripped apart in minutes. She thought about Daniel's smug smile and Victoria's cold voice telling her to leave. Then she hit the call button. The next afternoon, Emily sat in a quiet corner of a small cafe downtown, nervously stirring a cup of cappuccino she hadn't touched. The bell above the door jingled, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Mark Hayes hadn't changed much since college. Still tall, still with that easy confidence in the way he carried himself, though his hair was shorter now, and the sharp cut of his suit gave him a more polished, professional look. Emily Carter, he said with a grin as he reached her table. It's been, 8 years? You look exactly the same, minus the messy bun and 3 empty coffee cups on your desk. She couldn't help but laugh. And you've gone from arguing with professors to billing people for arguments. Exactly, he said, sliding into the seat across from her. Now tell me what happened. Chloe said it's serious. Emily hesitated for a moment, then began from the start. The sudden call to Victoria's office, the accusations about Daniel, the immediate firing, and the cold indifference that followed. She told him about the job rejections, the shift in tone from potential employers, and her suspicion that Victoria had poisoned her reputation in the industry. Mark listened without interrupting, his expression calm but focused. Every so often, he made small notes in a leather-bound pad he'd pulled from his briefcase. When Emily finished, she exhaled heavily, as if telling the story out loud had drained her. So? She asked. Am I being paranoid? Mark shook his head. Not at all. What you're describing is classic defamation. It's hard to prove when it's all whispers and unspoken warnings, but it's not impossible. People like Victoria think they're untouchable because they operate behind closed doors. Emily frowned. She is untouchable. She's got money, influence, and connections everywhere. Mark leaned forward slightly. No one's untouchable, Emily. They just haven't met the right opposition yet. His tone was calm, but there was a weight behind his words that made her pulse quicken. I'm not saying this will be easy, he continued, but the Westmonts have enemies. People they've stepped on to get where they are. Find those people, and you'll find cracks in their armor. And when there are cracks, I can work with that. Emily sat back, thinking about all the former employees she'd met over the years. Some had left quietly, but others had left angry, muttering about Victoria's temper or Daniel's behavior at company events. Maybe there was more to their stories than she knew. Mark's gaze held hers. If you want to clear your name and make sure they can't do this to anyone else, you have to be willing to dig. And once you start, you can't stop halfway. You go all the way. Emily's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. A week ago, she wouldn't have believed she had it in her to fight someone like Victoria Westmont. But now, sitting across from Mark, hearing the quiet certainty in his voice, she felt the first real spark of something she hadn't felt since losing her job, control. All right, she said, her voice steady. Let's find those cracks. Mark smiled faintly, like he'd been waiting for her to say exactly that. The plan started small. Just a list of names Emily remembered from her years at Westmont Interiors. People who had left suddenly, without farewell emails or LinkedIn updates, or those who had quietly disappeared after tense weeks in the office. Mark suggested they start with the ones who seemed the most bitter when they left. For the first few days, Emily sent out casual messages, framing them as friendly catch-ups. She was careful not to mention Victoria or Daniel right away. Some didn't reply at all, but others agreed to meet for coffee or talk over the phone. The first was a project manager named Lisa, who had been with the company for over a decade before resigning abruptly. Over a cappuccino in a quiet cafe, Lisa leaned forward and lowered her voice. "Victoria humiliated me in front of a client," she said, "over a mistake Daniel made. I took the blame because I didn't want my career ruined, but she still spread the word that I was incompetent. Do you know how many contracts I lost after that?" Emily listened carefully, noting every detail. When Lisa left, she sent a quick text to Mark. "We have our first lead." The next meeting was with IRENE, a former junior designer like Emily. He had lasted only 6 months. "She plays favorites," IRENE said bitterly. "If you're not on her list, you'll never get credit for your work. Daniel? He's worse. He flirts with anyone under 30, and if you don't flirt back, suddenly your projects are reassigned." By the end of the week, Emily's notebook was filling up. Stories of intimidation, blacklisting, and quiet threats. Most of them ended the same way: careers damaged beyond repair. Mark reviewed her notes one evening in his office. "This isn't just petty workplace drama," he said. "This is a pattern. Abuse of power, targeted defamation, retaliation, the kind of thing that, if it went public, could dismantle their image entirely." Emily's hands tightened around the folder she carried. "Then we need more. Enough to make sure they can't just bury it." That's when Mark suggested speaking with a name Emily hadn't considered: Samantha Hughes, the former head of HR. She had left suddenly 2 years ago, and no one knew why. Tracking her down wasn't easy. She'd moved to another city and changed industries completely. But when Emily finally reached her, Samantha agreed to talk. They met in a quiet diner on the edge of town. Samantha wasted no time. "Victoria runs her company like a monarchy," she said, her eyes sharp. "Daniel causes the mess. Victoria cleans it up by destroying whoever's in the way. I filed reports, real, documented complaints from employees, but Victoria made them disappear. And when I pushed back, I was gone the next week." Emily felt a chill. This was more than she'd expected to find. She realized the stories weren't just connected. They formed a chain, and she was the next link. When she left the diner that night, she wasn't just holding a folder of testimonies. She was holding the beginning of a weapon. And for the first time since she'd been escorted out of Westmont Interiors, she smiled. Not out of joy, but out of certainty. If you'd like, I can continue with Chapter 8, Cracks in the Marriage, where Emily begins to learn from her sources that Daniel's behavior is not just a workplace problem, but a personal one that's already putting stress on his marriage to Victoria, giving her a new angle for her revenge. It was Chloe who convinced Emily to attend the industry gala. "You can't disappear from the scene," she said, handing Emily an elegant black dress she'd borrowed from a friend. "Let people see you. Let them remember you're still here." Emily wasn't sure she wanted to walk into a room full of people who might have heard Victoria's version of her firing, but she understood the strategy. Staying visible meant she wasn't hiding in shame, and it might be a chance to hear things she couldn't through formal interviews. The ballroom was warm with golden lighting, the air filled with the clinking of champagne flutes and the hum of polite conversation. Emily moved through the crowd, smiling politely at familiar faces. Some greeted her warmly, others hesitated, eyes flickering with curiosity. She kept her head high. It didn't take long before she overheard the first piece of gossip. Near the buffet table, 2 women from a rival firm were speaking in low tones. "Did you see Daniel earlier? He's already been hovering near the interns." "That man never changes," the other replied with a smirk. "Victoria must have nerves of steel. Or maybe she just likes the lifestyle too much to care." Emily pretended to be interested in the appetizer tray, ears tuned sharply to their conversation. As she moved on, she heard more. A group of suppliers whispered about Daniel's reputation and how Victoria often smoothed over uncomfortable incidents to keep his image clean. When Emily finally spotted the Westmonts across the room, she saw it for herself. Daniel was speaking to a young marketing assistant, leaning just a little too close. The woman laughed politely, but her eyes darted around the room as if checking to see who was watching. And there was Victoria, standing a few feet away, talking to another group, but glancing toward her husband every so often. Her expression was unreadable. No visible anger, no public confrontation, just the composed mask of someone who had perfected the art of pretending. Emily stayed at a distance, observing. It was clear this wasn't an isolated habit of Daniel's. It was part of the fabric of their marriage. He strayed, and Victoria controlled the damage, keeping the public story intact. It made Emily's own firing feel even more absurd. Victoria hadn't acted to protect her marriage. She'd acted to protect the illusion. And Emily had been the perfect scapegoat because she was quiet, unconnected, and easy to remove. Later that evening, while chatting with an old vendor contact, Emily received confirmation. "Between you and me," the vendor said, lowering his voice, "Daniel's been doing this for years. Victoria knows. She just chooses her battles. Usually she goes after the woman instead, scares them off, makes sure they can't talk." Emily sipped her drink slowly, letting the words settle. It wasn't just about her anymore. She was one of many women who'd been targeted by Daniel and destroyed by Victoria's retaliation. And that meant there were more voices out there, voices that could help her. When she left the gala that night, the winter air felt sharper, almost invigorating. The hypocrisy she'd witnessed wasn't just infuriating, it was an opportunity. If she could pull back the curtain on their perfect facade, the Westmonts wouldn't just lose their power, they'd lose their mask. And that was when the real damage could begin. Back in her apartment, Emily sat at her desk with her laptop open, the cursor blinking in a blank email draft. In front of her was a folder of notes and documents, things she had collected over weeks of conversations with former employees, bits of information from suppliers, and subtle remarks she'd overheard at the gala. Most of it was still scattered and incomplete, but one particular detail stood out. A questionable contract with a luxury resort chain known for skirting building safety regulations. She had the name of the client, the date of the deal, and a whisper from a reliable source that bribes had been exchanged to secure the contract. It wasn't enough for a court case, but it was enough to raise eyebrows in the right circles. Emily created a new, untraceable email address and typed a short, carefully worded message. She kept it vague enough to protect herself, but pointed enough to spark curiosity. Then she attached a redacted version of the document and sent it to a mid-tier business blog, one that was known for chasing stories the bigger outlets often ignored. The next morning, while sipping coffee, Emily checked the site. Her tip had been posted as a developing story, buried halfway down the page. It wasn't front-page news, but it was there for anyone in the industry to see. Rumors of dubious dealings between Westmont Interiors and Blue Wave Resorts surface. By midday, she started to notice the ripple. A former colleague texted her out of the blue. "Did you see the article? Victoria's been pacing all morning." Emily pretended to be surprised, texting back a non-committal reply, but inside, something shifted. For the first time since she'd been fired, she felt in control. That evening, she heard from Mark. "It's a small hit, but it's a hit," he said over the phone. "They'll feel it. And if they react strongly to something this minor, imagine what happens when we drop something bigger." He was right. The Westmonts had built their reputation on polished deals and high-profile clients. Even a faint suggestion of corruption was enough to make investors uneasy. Emily imagined Victoria reading the article, calculating how much damage control she needed to do, and Daniel probably brushing it off without realizing the danger. It was only one seed, planted quietly and without fanfare. But seeds had a way of growing, especially when the soil was already cracked. Emily closed her laptop that night with a calm, steady breath. This wasn't about making headlines, not yet. This was about reminding them that she existed, that she could reach them without stepping into their world. And if the first seed could make them nervous, she couldn't wait to see what a garden of them would do. The exhibition hall was buzzing with the low hum of polite conversation, the faint scent of polished wood and fresh upholstery filling the air. Emily moved slowly between the displays, taking her time with each new collection. She wasn't here to buy. Her current budget didn't allow it. But attending events like this kept her connected to the industry and gave her the chance to observe. She carried a small notebook, jotting down design ideas and vendor names. She had just paused in front of a sleek walnut dining set when a familiar voice cut through the background noise. "Well, this is a surprise." Emily turned, and there was Daniel Westmont, dressed in a tailored navy suit that looked freshly pressed. He wore his usual self-assured smile, the kind that suggested he expected her to be flustered by his presence. "Mr. Westmont," she said evenly, straightening her posture. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Daniel," he corrected with a slight grin. "No need to be so formal. It's been a while, hasn't it?" Emily simply nodded, letting him do most of the talking. He stepped closer, inspecting the table beside them, though his eyes kept drifting back to her. "I've missed having you around the office," he said casually. "Things feel quieter without you." Emily tilted her head slightly. Quieter can be good. Less distraction. The remark was deliberate, a gentle pushback masked as a neutral observation. Daniel chuckled, clearly taking it as playful banter. "Always so focused. That's what I liked about you. You never let anyone get in your head." She met his gaze steadily. "I try not to, though sometimes it's hard when there's so much noise swirling around people." Something flickered in his expression, a momentary pause before his smile returned. "Noise?" "Oh, you know," she said lightly, as if it were nothing. "Articles, industry chatter, people do talk." She let the words hang just long enough to suggest she might know more than she was saying. Daniel studied her for a moment, the corners of his mouth tightening. Then he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Careful, Emily. The industry can be unforgiving to people who get caught up in the wrong conversations." She smiled faintly, unshaken. "I've noticed, but I've also learned that sometimes those conversations have a way of turning on the people who try to control them." It was subtle, but she saw it, the faintest shadow of uncertainty in his eyes. He straightened up, glancing toward a group of executives across the hall. "Well, it's been good seeing you. Enjoy the exhibition." Emily watched him walk away, his confident stride just a touch too quick, as if he needed to be somewhere else before she said something more. As she turned back to the walnut dining set, she felt it again, that quiet, steady satisfaction. The encounter had been short, but she'd seen it in him. The awareness that she wasn't just gone from their lives, that she was still close enough to be a problem. And problems, she thought, have a way of becoming much bigger if ignored. 2 days after the furniture exhibition, the ripple Emily had been waiting for finally began to show. Mark sent her a short text that morning. "They're fighting," loud. Emily didn't need to ask who they were. Word traveled quickly through the design world, especially in offices where gossip was an unspoken currency. From what Mark's source inside Westmont Interiors had overheard, Victoria had stormed into Daniel's office before lunch, slamming the door so hard the sound carried down the hall. "You promised me this was over," she had hissed, her voice low but sharp enough to slice through the air. "And now I have suppliers asking about rumors again. Do you think I enjoy cleaning up after you every time you decide to flirt with a staff member?" Daniel's reply had been just as heated. "This isn't about me. It's about you being paranoid and trying to control everything. The gossip is old. You're making it worse by reacting." From there, the argument escalated, accusations about his late nights, her constant need for control, and the way she handled the business. They weren't just fighting about Emily anymore. They were pulling on every loose thread in their marriage, and those threads were beginning to snap. The following week, Emily met Mark at a small cafe across from the Westmont building. Through the tall windows, they could see employees moving in and out, some glancing nervously toward the executive floor as if waiting for the next outburst. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore," Mark said, stirring his coffee slowly. "Half the staff has heard them argue. This kind of instability doesn't go unnoticed. Clients get nervous when leadership looks fractured." Emily leaned back in her chair, watching a pair of junior designers rush past with files in hand. "Good. Let them wonder if the company is as stable as it claims to be." Mark smirked. You're enjoying this more than you thought you would." She didn't deny it. "When I left here, they made me feel powerless. Now, they're showing everyone their weaknesses, without me lifting a finger." Still, she knew she couldn't just sit back and watch forever. The cracks in their marriage were widening, but cracks could be repaired if left alone long enough. What she needed was the right push, the kind that wouldn't just damage their image, it would make it impossible to fix. From inside the building, a movement caught Emily's eye. Victoria had stepped into the reception area, her face tight, her phone pressed to her ear. She glanced around quickly before disappearing back toward the elevators. "She's making calls," Emily said quietly, "probably to smooth things over." Mark followed her gaze, or to start another fight. Either way, they're distracted, and distracted people make mistakes. Emily let the thought settle, a plan beginning to take shape in the back of her mind. The Westmonts were too busy turning on each other to see her coming. And when she finally made her move, they'd never know which hit had done the real damage until it was too late. The plan had been ready for weeks, waiting only for the right moment. Emily had gathered everything: copies of questionable contracts, email exchanges between Daniel and shady subcontractors, and a spreadsheet that suggested large sums of money had been moved through shell companies. She hadn't stolen anything. The documents had come from former employees and suppliers who were all too eager to see the Westmonts fall. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Mark sent her a simple message: "Now." Emily uploaded the files to a secure server and forwarded them anonymously to 3 investigative journalists and 1 influential business blogger. Within hours, the first article went live. The headline was impossible to ignore: "Westmont Interiors tied to illegal kickbacks and fraudulent deals." By noon, the story had spread to larger news outlets. Photos of Victoria and Daniel, taken from past galas and magazine profiles, were suddenly plastered next to words like corruption, fraud, and misconduct. Television reporters gathered outside the sleek glass headquarters of Westmont Interiors, their umbrellas forming a jagged line along the curb. Inside the company, chaos erupted. Several major clients announced they were suspending partnerships until the matter was resolved. A luxury hotel group publicly cut ties, stating they had no tolerance for unethical practices. The company's stock value dipped sharply in just a few hours. For Victoria, the damage was more than financial, it was personal. Her brand had always been built on elegance, trust, and exclusivity. Now, her name was being whispered in the same breath as scandal and greed. She made frantic calls to board members, lawyers, and PR firms, her voice rising with each unanswered question. Daniel, on the other hand, faced a different kind of problem. The financial misconduct accusations caught the attention of regulators. That afternoon, 2 men in dark suits walked into the building, flashing official badges before heading straight for his office. He emerged 30 minutes later, pale and tight-lipped, escorted toward the elevators, while several employees watched from the hall. From across the street, Emily and Mark sat in Mark's car, observing the building like it was a stage and they were in the audience. "Think they figured out where it came from?" Mark asked. Emily shook her head. "They're too busy trying to save themselves to look for me. And even if they did, they couldn't prove a thing." They watched as Victoria exited the building, surrounded by 2 assistants holding folders over her head to shield her from the rain and flashing cameras. Reporters shouted questions, but she kept her chin high, refusing to answer. For Emily, it wasn't about the spectacle. It was about the shift. The power the Westmonts had once held over her career, her reputation, and her confidence was slipping away, replaced by panic and desperation. And she knew there was still one move left to make before this was over. The Westmont empire wasn't just cracking anymore. It was beginning to collapse. The ballroom shimmered under soft crystal lighting, the air filled with polite laughter and the clink of champagne glasses. Emily had almost skipped the charity event, but Chloe convinced her otherwise. "You've already proven you're not hiding," she'd said. "Besides, it'll drive them crazy to see you looking unbothered." Emily wore a simple but elegant navy dress, her hair swept back to keep her face clear and composed. She moved through the crowd, with the ease of someone who belonged there, even if she wasn't sure she truly did. People she hadn't spoken to in months stopped her to offer polite greetings, a few even whispering that they'd read that article and were shocked by the Westmont scandal. She was just finishing a conversation with a supplier when she felt it, a shift in the air, a presence approaching from behind. Enjoying yourself? Emily turned, and there she was, Victoria Westmont. Perfectly dressed in a deep emerald gown, her posture straight, but her eyes sharper than the diamond pendant at her throat. She didn't smile. "Mrs. Westmont," Emily said smoothly, her voice calm, "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." "Spare me the pleasantries," Victoria replied, stepping closer. "We both know why I'm here." Emily tilted her head slightly, feigning confusion. "Do we?" Victoria's gaze narrowed. "Don't play innocent with me. The documents, the articles, none of that happened by accident. You think you're clever, but you're not the first person to try to bring us down." Emily met her eyes without flinching, and yet somehow you're the one standing here, looking unsettled. Victoria's jaw tightened. "You've made a mistake. People will forget about this soon enough. And when they do, you'll still be exactly where I left you, on the outside, looking in." Emily's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Maybe, or maybe this time, you should blame the right person instead of destroying the wrong one." She let the words hang between them, her tone soft but deliberate. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The noise of the ballroom faded into the background, and Emily could see the flicker in Victoria's expression, a flash of recognition, maybe even doubt. "Careful, Emily," Victoria said finally, her voice low. "You don't know how far I'm willing to go." Emily's smile didn't fade. "I think I do, and I think you're already there." Without waiting for a reply, Emily stepped around her and melted back into the crowd, leaving Victoria standing alone, her grip tightening around her clutch. Emily didn't need her to admit anything. The look on Victoria's face had been enough. The woman who once had the power to end her career was now standing in a room full of people, wondering who else might see through her. And for Emily, that was victory enough, at least for now. In the weeks that followed the charity event, the Westmont name appeared in the news almost daily, each headline worse than the last. More clients withdrew, investors began selling their shares, and whispers in the industry turned into open discussions about the company's collapse. The empire that had once seemed untouchable was now balancing on the edge of ruin. Emily, meanwhile, kept her distance. She didn't need to interfere anymore. The momentum of their downfall carried itself. Instead, she focused on her own future. The calls began trickling in slowly at first, then more frequently. Firms she'd admired for years were suddenly inviting her for interviews. Some offered to match her previous salary, others promised creative freedom she'd never had at Westmont Interiors. One offer stood out, a small but growing design studio in the heart of the city. The owner, a warm woman named Helen, had seen Emily's work in an old magazine feature and remembered it. "We value ideas here, not politics," Helen had said during the interview. "You'd be free to design the way you want." 2 weeks later, Emily walked into her new office for the first time. It wasn't large or glamorous, but it felt alive. Samples scattered on work tables, sketches pinned to walls, the hum of conversation full of energy rather than tension. For the first time in months, she felt wanted for what she could create, not judged for what she had never done. One quiet evening after work, Emily met Mark at their usual cafe. The city outside the window glowed with warm street lights, the air crisp with early spring. "You look different," Mark said, leaning back in his chair with an easy smile. "Lighter." Emily stirred her tea. "Maybe because I finally stopped carrying them with me. All that anger, it's exhausting." He studied her for a moment, his expression softer than usual. "So, was it worth it?" She thought about the Westmonts, about the panic in Victoria's eyes, the uncertainty in Daniel's voice the last time she'd seen him. Then she thought about the calls from her new colleagues, the excitement of starting fresh. "It was never about destroying them," she said quietly. "It was about proving to myself that they couldn't destroy me." Mark's gaze held hers for a moment longer, and there was an unspoken warmth there. Something new, something steady. She didn't rush to name it, but she didn't shy away from it either. They left the cafe together, walking side by side through the soft glow of the street lamps. For Emily, the city no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a place where she could breathe again, create again, live again. And as the cool night air brushed against her skin, she knew one thing for certain: her story wasn't ending here. It was only just beginning.